Thank you. Check, check. Okay, there we go. You are the most patient and dedicated folks. So, you're here till the bitter end. We appreciate you. Thank you very much, especially because it's beautiful outside. So let's first of all start off with some introductions. And I'm not a professional facilitator or moderator, so I am just faking it till I make it up here. Appreciate your patience. So we're going to do some introductions. We have some prepared questions, but we're thinking that because it's the last session and you've had a lot of talking heads in front of you, that it would be great to open this up for questions during our conversation. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. And then I believe Lauren has a microphone. She could probably pop over and make sure that everybody hears you. So with that, let's start our introductions, and then we'll jump into our questions. And after that, let's have some fun and learn. So first, let's go with Kirsten. Kirsten, would you like to introduce yourself and let people know who you are and why you're here and your expertise, please?
Thanks, Brian. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kirsten Ray. I'm at the Oregon Field Office of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. I work closely with federal, state, and local partners to develop affordable housing solutions that are not only accessible but resilient in the face of the growing disasters and concerns that we're seeing here across the West. I recently completed a deployment with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and I was responding to Hurricanes Helene and Milton, and I was stationed in Florida. The experience was a stark reminder of how natural disasters are increasing in both frequency and in impact. These are affecting homes, families, and entire communities. And it's a challenge that hits close to home for me. I grew up in the Palisades area, in an area that was just completely devastated by wildfire. I mean, the high school and soccer fields and friends' houses just completely gone. And it highlights just how vulnerable our housing systems can be to these events. And in Oregon, we face, it seems like almost all the disasters. We have wildfires, floods, earthquakes, ice storms, tsunamis. We have, I think we had a tornado. I mean, we have all the natural disasters. And at the same time, the region is dealing with a severe housing shortage driven by years of underproduction, federal underinvestment, and rapid population growth. And these overlapping challenges make it clear that we need to approach housing differently with a focus on resilience, sustainability, and affordability. And as we've explored together over the past 2 days, these solutions to these challenges require collaboration across sectors and across levels of government. Federal programs play a key role in helping states like Oregon align housing production with these new environmental realities, invest in adaptive housing, and ensure that resources are directed to the communities that need them the most. And I'm honored to join this final session where we have the opportunity to bring together what we've been discussing all day long and yesterday. I'm hoping that we can focus on putting together our resources and coming up with ideas to build stronger, more sustainable communities. I want to thank Governor Kotek and Governor Lewin Grisham, the WGA, and all of you for your continued work in this challenging space. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. Let's move to Doug Green.
Thanks, Brian. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Doug Green. I am here to speak Wildfire. My background includes a stint as a land use planner here for the city of Bend. And then after that, I did a 180 and spent the next 25 years working for the City of Bend Fire Department as a firefighter and in other roles throughout my career there. Currently, I work for an organization called Headwaters Economics, which is based in Bozeman, Montana. Headwaters is a nonprofit, nonpartisan group that focuses on community hazard resiliency and helping those communities make informed land management decisions with that risk and those hazards in mind. Within Headwaters, I manage what's called the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire Program, or the CPAW program for short. We help communities reduce the risk of wildfire through the lens of land use planning. We also offer communication strategies for those communities and do customized research to help them better understand their wildfire problem and the best solutions for that wildfire. We started in 2015 and have since worked in, I think, 80 communities across the country, from big communities like LA County, like San Diego, to really small low-capacity places in Montana, in eastern Colorado, northern Florida. So we're really good at understanding, yeah, there's a lot of tools in the toolbox, but certain ones work in certain places, and it's really important to find what works for those communities so it's palatable and adaptable to that community. The other thing is we are a free service. So everything we do for communities, all our land use planning capacity help, all of our research is free, which is super important to low capacity communities, especially if they may have one planner or maybe a volunteer fire chief. We're able to come in there and help them understand their risks and help them implement strategies to reduce those risks. Really, our vision is that we want to have communities understand the risk from hazards to those communities and make really smart, educated, and informed choices as they move forward with the design and planning of those communities. I mean, we hope to see communities that understand the inevitability of wildfire in a lot of cases, take the blow of that wildfire and come out the other side with the least amount of damage to homes, the least amount of impact to their economy, and no loss of life or injuries, right? And we know how to do that. We know there's the science is out there. We know how to build homes and communities that will not burn down. So it's not a science piece. It's a social science piece. It's getting communities to understand how to do that, getting leaders to make those tough choices, and getting funding so those things can be implemented. So again, we know the solutions. It's just we're trying to help communities get there. So thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Let's move on to Jeff. Jeff, why don't you introduce yourself and provide a brief opening statement?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm Jeff Pemstein with the National Association of Home Builders, and I am absolutely thrilled to be on this panel with this group of people at this late hour, and I appreciate all of you still being here. So, and National Association of Home Builders, we are the largest trade association for home building in the country. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C. I am their first official person on the West Coast. So I reside in Sacramento, California, and have been with NAHB for all of 3.5 months. So before that, I spent 22 years building houses. I built about 3,000 houses in Northern California and Northern Nevada. Before that, I was a city planner. So I have several mental illnesses, and we can talk about those at a later time. But I appreciate, Governor Lujan Grisham and Governor Kotek and the WGA staff. You know, we at NAHB, we talk about housing, right? And seeing both presidential candidates make housing top of the fold on all of their debates and all of their discussions. We're thrilled to see that. Also really appreciated the staff and the mayor from Bend and seeing some of those projects. Totally impressive. I think what the city of Bend has done is an example of what we can do. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about resiliency in housing. And so I'm one of these people who thinks that words actually have meaning. And so there's resilience and there's resistance. And to me, resilience is when you have a catastrophe, how do you bounce back, right? What are the things that make you get back to where you were or to something better? Resistance is what I think we really are talking about, which is how do we build communities? How do we build housing that's going to be able to resist combustion, resist ignition? And so you'll permit me a quick story here, but much like Kirsten, I too am from Southern California. I'm from Pasadena. And so the neighborhood that I was born and raised in no longer exists. My family is still down there. My sister lives in Altadena, and she lives in a house that was built in 1947. So her neighborhood no longer exists, but her house still stands. And so her and I have talked every day, and she is still living in with her 3 children and husband in a VRBO, not knowing when they're going to get back into their home. And we've had lots of conversations about why is her 1947 house still standing? Her next door neighbor's house is still standing, but every other house in the neighborhood no longer stands. And we sort of landed on the fact that last year she got popped by her insurance company. They did a drone flyover of her neighborhood. And they said, hey, we're not going to renew your insurance unless you cut the vegetation back and you redo your roof because you've got damage everywhere. So a roof's an expensive undertaking. You know, landscape modification, that's just sweat. You know, that's just work. You know, you get out there with a scythe or a chainsaw or whatever. I love running chainsaws. They're lots of fun if you've never done it. And then a few other things, you know, like, attic venting, right? So maybe putting some better mesh on that. And we think those things actually played a difference in her house being resistant to combustion. So, you know, I think the issues that we face now are more along the lines of, look, we have a huge existing housing stock, whether it's in California or elsewhere, and I think that's where the majority of the issues are. New construction, especially in California, because I know California the best, we have Section 7A of our state, you know, California Building Code, and those are our WUI requirements, our wildland urban interface building requirements. The new communities, the master plan communities, I would encourage you to look at a master plan community called Tejon Ranch, which is in the Tejon Pass between Bakersfield and Los Angeles. The planning efforts there, the planning efforts that they're putting in to building a community that will be resistant to fires, I think is one of those state-of-the-art things. How we fix the existing housing stock, that's for much smarter people, but I'm happy to engage and listen, and Kirsten's probably got the answer to how that's going to happen. So, anyway, thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Jeff. My name's Brian Rankin again. I'm a senior strategist for the city of Bend. So I'm a local practitioner. I apologize. I just work at the lowly local level. And so my job is to help our community, our decision makers, create long-range plans for the community to guide our economic development, our housing supply, housing construction, ultimately, as well as link that with our infrastructure planning. And in the case of Bend, also make considerations for resiliency and the natural hazard risks that are abundant in our area. In particular, it's wildfire. So wildfire is our big one here in Bend. So that's my day job. And I think just to keep it brief, in the state of Oregon, many of you probably know we have a very robust statewide planning system here. And so my perspective here as a local is really interfacing with the state and really what states can do. I personally think outside of additional funding for massive infrastructure and projects and additional funding for affordable housing through CDBH that, CDBG, excuse me, confusing that with other legal substances, then that we really can empower states. States and locals are where this innovation, I think, is going to happen. I don't think housing innovation is really going to get a lot of traction in the near future. So I am really focused on what states can do, and just from the Oregon experience and what's happening at the state level here and how we're implementing that locally, I just want to share that experience and say that state reforms in things like, hey, we have to allow middle housing types in single unit detached neighborhoods. So essentially getting rid of single unit kind of zoning and prohibitions on different housing types in existing neighborhoods is a huge tool that can help unlock the potential for infill in existing cities. And in addition to parking reforms, something that's very mundane, parking reforms, getting rid of minimum parking requirements. The state taking an active role in tinkering. So each state here is different. You're all representing different states with different regulatory environments. In Oregon, this governor and legislature are tinkering, and they're experimenting, and they're allowing communities like Bend to conduct those experiments, and we're seeing positive results. And just very quickly, some recent examples as a result of state legislation have allowed Bend to do some things that are a little bit different, including expanding our urban area to have minimum amounts, so a mandatory percentage of deed-restricted affordable housing at levels around 80% AMI and less. So in other words, you can come into an urban area if you provide a minimum percentage, and some of these cases are upwards of 20 and 30% of the housing being affordable at those lower levels of affordability. And in addition, these developments have also supported and will be built to higher standards for fire resiliency. And the private sector, the private market is jumping at the opportunity to do this. That's the expansion side, but I don't want to undersell the importance of making the best use of your urban lands inside of areas that are already either fairly low risk or lower risk than expanding into some of these other higher risk areas. So I'll keep it short, and we'll get to the first question. Okay. So, panel. As extreme weather and natural disasters become increasingly common, how can we balance the need for more resilient housing without sacrificing crucial affordability considerations? And please touch on both new construction and retrofitting the existing housing stock. Who wants to take a stab at this first? I'm looking for volunteers. Doug?
I'll stab at it. So I think, first of all, to just preface this conversation about wildfire, is we need to understand that this is not a wildfire problem, right? This is a structural ignition problem. If we build homes, if we build communities that don't burn down, then we don't have this problem. And because of that, we understand the science to keep communities and to keep homes from burning down. We know the science. We've done exhaustive research. Not me, but a lot of really smart people have done that. And so we know how to keep communities from burning down. And we have, I think Jeff said this earlier, there's 115 million people who live in what we call the WUI in this country. That's a third of our population lives in the WUI, and the majority of the land in the western states that still can be developed is in the WUI, that wildland urban interface. I hate that term. I'm going to say that right now. I'm going to say wildfire-prone lands, because when you say wildfire urban interface, people think of a line drawn around a community. You're safe here, you're not safe here, and that's not how it is, especially when we look at ember transfer, things like that. We're talking about an area that in fire-prone lands. All right, so there's a lot of people who live in these lands. There's a lot of people who are going to be living in these lands. But we know how to keep these communities safe. And I'm going to steal a little bit of Kirsten's thunder here, because affordability and building resistant homes are not mutually exclusive, right? They go hand in hand, because when you build a home, a standard home, at Headwaters we've done a lot of research on this. When you build a standard home and then you build one that meets wildfire requirements, the cost is a lot of times neutral. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but a lot of the things Jeff used when he built homes are the same thing that keeps homes safe. Class A roofs, double pane windows, siding, et cetera. So there's not a huge difference when you're talking about new homes. Retrofits can certainly be more expensive when you're replacing roofs, when you're replacing windows, but there's also retrofits that can be done for a couple $1,000s to existing housing stock that can make a huge difference. So we know how to do this. And I think I also want to remind everybody that if we don't do this, you think you have a housing problem before a fire? When you start burning half your housing stock down in a community, then you have a housing problem. Then you have an affordability problem, because housing prices go up, rent goes up, et cetera. So we need to do it on the front end. We know how to do it on the front end. It's not more expensive on the front end. I think FEMA did a study that said $1 spent on the front end of this equals $4 on the back end. So it's the right way to do it. And I think Jeff said this earlier also. The problem is not the current building codes and what we're doing now. It's this tremendous amount of housing stock that's out there. I think, and this is a quick guess, only 5% of the homes in California that burnt this time were built after 2008, which is when Chapter 7A, the WUI code in California, the strictest code in the country, the code that every state should be going toward, was done. So you're talking a tiny percentage of the homes were built after this code. So we can't look at California or any other place that has had these disasters as an example of whether codes, whether land use practices, whether building the right way works or not, because we just don't know. It's been so recently since these codes have been enacted, we just don't have the housing stock under these codes, and we haven't, luckily, had a huge wildfire hit these places to see what the results are. We've had small places where, yeah, they work. I mean, they work in research, and they work in real life when it comes to these things. But we know how to do it, and again, there is not a difference between an affordable home and a safe home. And we owe that to the people in our community. No matter what income level they're at, they need to live in a safe home. So go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. That's a key point that Doug just made, is that these two things are not mutually exclusive. You can build an affordable home that is also resistant to natural disasters. I'm going to mention a couple of HUD programs, federal programs, but the takeaway here is that I want you to see me as a resource to all the federal programs, and if you want to learn more about these programs, please just ask me to put together a pretty package for you so that you don't have to navigate Google. That's what I'm here for, but I need to mention these programs because they're important for this conversation. So we at HUD promote the use of energy efficient, durable materials through the HOME program and through the Community Development Block Grant Program. I know that there's HOME and CDBG grantees in this room. And we saw that yesterday on the tour at the Habitat site, the use of these funds. These funds can support technologies that are crucial for climate resilient considerations like green roofs, permeable pavement, and fire-resistant building materials. I'm really glad that Doug brought up a little bit of the cost comparison. That it doesn't necessarily cost a lot more to build a concrete exterior than it does for another type of siding. We see really great examples of this already in Oregon, of resilient technologies. For example, Walsh Construction is doing some really great work. Habitat is doing some really great work. Reach Community Development Corporation, just to name a few, and these are all using HUD subsidies in their designs. To talk about retrofitting for a minute, there's a couple of FEMA programs. The Hazard Mitigation Grant Program can be used for retrofitting existing housing. There's also FEMA's BRIC program, which I only mentioned because they just opened their NOFO, $750 million available for preparedness and building resilient housing for natural disasters, and I think maybe you have some experience with that program, okay, to talk about. But examples of using these funds to retrofit existing housing includes reinforcing roofs, or I had never been to Florida before, and I didn't realize that you could just raise a floor 15 feet, a house 15 feet in the air, but you can use funds to do things like that. And these upgrades not only protect investments, but they lower the long-term repair costs, which preserves the affordability for the residents.
Kirsten, do you think those are funded adequately to be deployed at the scale that might be required in the West to address some of these risks?
No.
Okay, so there's a clear point for lobbying there. Okay, all right. So fund these programs that Kirsten is talking about. There you go. Jeff, what are your
Yeah,
thoughts?
that's hilarious. Yes. Okay. So, and again, I know this is the disaster du jour is fire. I mean, we do have earthquakes in the West. We do have floods in the West, and so it's interesting because wildfires and because of climate and what we see happening have become so horrific in their scale and their magnitude. I think if we don't take and triple our funding, quadruple our funding, and our attention to retrofitting existing housing, then we are going to make the housing shortage, because somebody said they didn't like the word crisis earlier, and I kind of go with that. Crisis. We have been working towards this shortage of housing for a long time, and so now that we're here and all of us are recognizing that we have this shortage, let's not make the situation worse. 12,000 houses just burned down in Southern California, right? So our estimates, and I always use statistics. Somebody once said statistics never lie and liars never use statistics. Something along those lines. But we're supposed to build 2.5 million houses between now and 2030 in California just to keep up with families, family formations and population growth. And in our best year, California built like 220 100,000 houses in 1 year. It was 1986. So we just, I mean, it's just physically, it's an impossibility. And now we've lost all these homes. And then we had the Caldor fire, we had the Camp Fire, and those communities are not being rebuilt. So let's not exacerbate it. Let's really try to put our best foot forward in these communities where we still have a lot of housing stock that is susceptible to fires and yet is affordable and exists. And so if we can put more money into that, I think that's going to be money ultimately well spent.
Thank you. All right, we're going to open this up for questions, and I know some people in this audience, just a few,
I have one.
but oh, I'm so excited. Thank you. I was going to shame some people I know, so thank you for preventing that shaming.
I
Appreciate that.
have a question for Kirsten. I want to say thank you for all of the investment HUD has made into our Southern Oregon recovery from the 2020 Alameda and South Oban chain fires. We lost over 3,000 structures, and it wasn't until this Christmas that the first award was made from the CBDGR funding for homeowner replacement and reconstruction. So I know that timeline is similar in Paradise and other communities. I am wondering if there are any efforts that HUD is making internally to make that process more nimble so that we can get recovery funds to our survivors more quickly.
Yeah, I know that that's a hot topic right now, and disaster survivors can't afford to wait such a long time to get the resources that they need. The way that these appropriations work is that after a presidentially declared disaster, Congress allocates funding, and yes, it's great that HUD was able to provide the state of Oregon with $422 million, recognizing that the need was well over $1 billion. But we've been working with Oregon Housing and Community Services to get the dollars out. They're the ones that are managing that community development block grant disaster recovery fund.
Thank you for the question. Are there any more questions on this one? All right. Let's move on to the next. Oh, yes, please. Thank you, by the way. Let's keep this interesting. We want to answer your questions more than be talking heads, so.
Yeah, I guess it's a question/comment. But that is, some of these wildfires or floods are unprecedented in either scope, frequency, the location, the time. Fires in LA, I don't know if I recall fires like in the middle of the winter, which is normally the rainy season. So, it just seems like it's so hard to predict. Like, for example, when I look at the FEMA maps, they don't necessarily reflect, if there's a disaster that just happened, I look at the FEMA maps, it doesn't necessarily show up as a high risk in the FEMA. So it's just a comment. I don't know how to address it, but it just makes the challenge that much more challenging, I think, for like, where do you deploy these precious dollars? Where do you do the resistance investments? So,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Are there any responses? Any thoughts?
Yeah, let me jump in on that. I agree with you. I mean, what could be worse than having a wildfire in January in Southern California? Now, again, I grew up there, right? So it's probably the last thing we would think of. October, yeah, October is two things. October is earthquake and fire season in Southern California. Don't ask me why. That's when they happen. But yeah, I mean, and so again, how do you prepare for that? I mean, that's a large, that's a large metropolitan area. So I think there makes some sense in investing back to make sure that the existing housing stock gets taken care of. But trying to predict when these things are going to happen, weather people are the only folks who are right 50% of the time and still get paid. So that's not us. If we're right 50% of the time, we're probably waiting tables or, serving coffee or something. So it's a great question, though.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have another question.
Hi, Karna Gustafson, attorney for VF Law, represent builders and developers. I have a question for Headwaters, Doug Green. With the land use policies of putting housing more close together and more densely populated, and Oregon, as we know, has a land use policy to put more housing inside a city, has there been any research on the fire activity with having these houses so close together and the jumping of embers between the homes?
Thank you, Karna.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a great question. Yes and no. So there has been research on how homes burn down. Again, homes burn down, we're not going to go into basic fire science here, but homes burn down from 3 ways. Ember intrusion, or embers, direct flame, and radiant heat. You know, and by far the most common is through embers. So they get lofted miles ahead of a fire, they land on anything flammable and combustible, ignite, and that's how these communities burn down. The problem is, once you start burning homes down, and I'll get to your answer, I promise. Once you start burning homes down, then you no longer have a wildland fire, right? You have, what we saw in LA was an urban fire. It was not a wildland fire. It may have started in the wildlands, but it's an urban, structure-to-structure urban conflagration. And that's a different animal. That is extreme radiant heat. You know, when you have setbacks of, let's say, 5 feet from the property line, so you got 10-foot setbacks, and Jeff can probably agree with me on this, no matter how you build that home, unless it's a concrete bunker, that next home is going to ignite when you have that many homes burning. And that's when you get this domino effect of home and home. And you can look at the pictures after these fires, the vegetation's still green. There's still trees there. It's not a crown fire. It's not a wildland fire. It is an urban conflagration, and that's a different animal. And so when we talk about how to keep structures from burning, yeah, we know that. When it comes to high density, because that's how a lot of ways you get this affordable housing, increase the density. And when I think about high density, I also think it's not just homes built closely. We're talking about multifamily housing. That's high density too. And that's easier to protect because then the building code comes into play and we can put sprinklers in, and there's a lot more codes we can do to protect multifamily housing above a duplex. But when you're talking about high density homes in communities, if we're building them new, we can still make those communities safe. You know, you increase the walls, the windows are obviously double pane, and there's areas where we're working in California where if you build homes on the walls that face another home, you don't put windows on that wall because that's where the radiant heat's going to come from, right? Or there are ways you can develop these especially when builders and fire people and planners get in a room ahead of time and understand the problem. Because in all the communities we worked in, everybody has the same concerns. They want safe homes, they want safe communities, they want to be profitable, and they want to build the right way. And so even in high density homes, there are ways you can do it. You can put streets around the outside of it, right, to keep that fire from going into or outside of that community. You can build with higher standards, again, not putting windows in walls that are next to each other. I'm sure there's other ways that Jeff knows that I don't, but there are ways you can meet those high density standards and still meet the fire piece of it, because again, that's really what, and last thing I'll add to this, obviously with higher density, fire departments like it as well. When there's a wildland fire coming into a dense neighborhood, they can protect more than one structure at a time. When you're talking about a neighborhood where there's a house on every half acre, let's say, one fire truck takes one house and that's it. So you run out of resources in a hurry. City of Bend has 5 fire stations. You get 5 or 6 homes on fire and you're done. And so when you can make those homes closer together, you can defend more homes. Water systems are better, more hydrants. So there's a lot of opportunities with that as well. I'm sure there's somebody else who wants to comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll just close this out by mentioning quickly, you know, in the question of how do we balance that need for housing without sacrificing the affordability considerations is really also a matter of state and local. So states, fed, state, and local can all look at, honestly looking at risk assessments. So what are the risks? And being honest about those risks, using the best data and the best science available. Much of that is funded through the federal government or the state government. Locals have to use that science, though, and you have to avoid those high-risk areas, and where you are moving into them, be aware of the risks and be willing to mitigate those risks. And then avoid developing in the highest risk areas. So that is often a local function and a local feature that is up to local governments, but your state laws have to support that or encourage that. And again, getting back to infill, making sure that you are making good use of the land that you already have inside your urban area, because those new structures, as we mentioned before, are built to better and higher codes. And now, oh, we have another question. I am so sorry. I thought I was moving on, but no.
Yeah,
please.
it is probably more related to the last topic.
Yeah.
Keith Harris, I'm with the Department of Veterans Affairs, is not a veteran-related question. I'm stuck on something Jeff said earlier. I know this panel is on building resilient, resistant housing. I'm still stuck on the idea of not losing what we have and being able to make what we already have a bit more resilient or resistant. And Doug, you talked about, we know the science of this. Is there a little checklist, 1, 2, 3, that could be kind of mass scale done on existing housing, whether it has to do with change something to the eaves or the vents? And are there plans to do that? Like just do it to all the houses?
Good
That
question.
are anywhere close to ours?
I think this is a Doug question. Doug and
Yeah,
Jeff.
we'll take it on.
Tag
Go
team.
for
Yeah, you
man.
got it.
Well, I'll start real quick. Yes, there are those checklists. They're not distributed at a national level. I mean, they're available online for sure, but there's certainly a checklist. Like, if this is your home, here are the most important things to do. Here, and even at Headwaters, we've developed things with communities like ranking them based on cost, ranking them based on, it's tough, and you'll see this out there, but it's tough to rank them on importance, because the importance of mitigating a certain component depends on where that house is located. Is it on a slope? Is there a house next door? Do they have an RV park there? That's going to kind of depend on what, that's why we don't like to rank them in terms of importance sometimes. We'll rank them in terms of cost. So that is out there. I think I'm going to let Jeff say something here shortly, but I want to make sure I bring something, Brian, that this is the biggest issue we face, and this is where the federal government needs to step in, because it is expensive to retrofit homes. It can be, and there's a lot of folks who've lived in a home 20, 30, 40 years. My folks couldn't retrofit their home. I mean, they couldn't afford to put in new windows and a new roof. So this is a place where the federal government can step in, fund this issue, and take on this challenge of helping communities retrofit homes, giving them the resources of what to do on a weekend, what to do themselves, what they need to hire a contractor to do. There's lots of ways to switch that up, but it is out there for sure. It's just depending on what community you're in.
So 100% agree with that, and it's a great question. And it can't overemphasize, but it's a matter of money, right? So I mean, how much money is out there? And it's really two levels. It's retrofitting the house, which, you know, unless you're a DIY person, you know, replacing windows, that's a big ticket item. Replacing roof, big ticket item. Doing your vegetation and managing your landscape around your property, most of us can do that. But then, and even California's got, you know, vegetation management requirements, but then it comes down to enforcement. And so I think as we watch each of these communities go down the way that they've gone down, this is a level of consciousness that needs to be increased, along with funding to help support it. So.
And this is in the continuum, the large continuum of housing that we've talked about today. Just for the affordable housing providers out there, there are federal funds available to support this type of retrofitting that they're talking about. The community change grants through EPA, the HUD's Green and Resilient Retrofit Program, which we just wrapped up, but Oregon saw almost $20 million of competitive funding land here. FEMA's hazard mitigation grants and BRIC grants. There are federal sources that I'd be happy to work with you on.
Can I do a quick follow-up, Brian?
Please.
There are federal funding sources, agreed, and it's important for sure. I just need to say that so much of our federal funding goes not toward community resilience, right? We spend billions of dollars on landscape treatments on the forest, which is definitely needed. We need to log, we need to prescribe burn, we need to thin, we need all those things. But we're not going to log our way, we're not going to prescribe burn our way out of this problem, right? So yeah, we need that stuff. It's super important. A lot of our money comes from the Forest Service. It's super important, but some of that money needs to go to communities to help them take on this problem and make their communities safer. So I just want to add that.
Thanks for the great questions, folks. This is more fun when you're involved. So we'll move on to our second question here. All right, how do you align land use planning and development as the West grows rapidly with environmental considerations in vulnerable areas? let's take a stab at that. You're looking at the planners if I have the answers.
I'll
Go for it,
I'll take a
Doug.
quick stab
Get
because
it.
it's going to be your subject.
Right.
But from what we do, land use policies are probably the most powerful tool local governments have in reducing and managing risks to their community. I mean, you have zoning codes which tell you where you can build, how you can build, what's the density going to be like, where can you put a commercial building. You have building codes on how safe that building is going to be, fire codes, what the hydrants are going to look like. Subdivision codes, can you get people in and out of those subdivisions in an emergency? And one of my favorite, the landscape codes. As simple as that is, it is probably the most effective tool when it comes to mitigating the risk of a built community, is just a landscape code in there. So these codes can offer tremendous support and power to mitigate the risk to the community. We just need to make sure that we give our planners and city staff the funding and the support and the capacity that they need to make these changes and to be able to use these tools to make the right decisions.
Do you have anything, Jeff?
Yeah, I do. As a former land use planner, I think, I think we're doing a pretty good job on some of our, like I mentioned earlier, about the master plan communities. But one of the things that I think that we're lacking on an overall planning perspective, and maybe this is something to spend some time with as well, because again, we've seen these massive fires in the last couple of years. Evacuation preparedness, emergency response preparedness. I think in a lot of these cases we are woefully inadequate. And so again, that's maybe a less of a funding issue, but that's more, again, one of those things as you're preparing plans, as you're looking at your community and how it's going to grow. The campfire, I mean, is a classic example of people trying to evacuate and not knowing where to go. I'm talking to my sister this morning. She's 2 weeks out of her house, almost 2 weeks out of her house, and she has no idea what's going on, where to get information from. And it's not that she's a dummy. She's a teacher. She's an educated person. She's on the internet. She's trying to find information, and there's just a lack of that information out there. So it's connected to land use planning, but I think it's also kind of part of that discussion that needs to continue with that.
Yeah, so just a few thoughts here, and I think you're touching on 2 points. There's what is the advanced planning that you can do as you're looking ahead to accommodate growth and build more housing. And so just a quick show of hands, how many folks are not from Oregon? Okay, so we have a lot of folks. How many, and of those folks, would you say that your statewide planning requirements and the local plans in your state are really geared towards high-quality, long-range planning? I am not seeing a lot of hands here. Okay. Well, so in Oregon, I just to share that, and I know folks from other states might look at Oregon and say that might be a little bit too much for us to bite off. And I might agree. It would be tough to create that system from scratch. But I think there are a lot of really good elements in Oregon land use planning that can apply to other states. And I think in particular, there are statewide planning goals where we have to weigh and balance these considerations. So I'm not saying copy and paste the Oregon system into other states, but I think it's fair to say, take a look at what your state is requiring or not requiring. And in terms of managing existing hazards, the existing built environment, and I think emergency response. And so that's one set. I'm talking more about the advanced planning that you can do. And that to me is really around saying, well, there are certain elements of plans that should be required. And if you're a state and a state government, that could be requirement, shall. In Oregon, it's a shall, so it's not elective. But essentially, they are. In Oregon, you are going to do your 20-year plans, and those 20-year plans must weigh and balance a number of considerations, including your growth, your economic development, your infrastructure systems, as well as addressing natural hazards and a whole variety of other topics. So communities in Oregon have to do this. And I think that is one big reason why, at least in the city of Bend and Deschutes County and the cities here, we've been able to absorb that growth without, I think, a lot of the negative side effects that some of the other communities in the West are experiencing, because we do have plans. And these plans require you to weigh and balance these considerations up front. And in essence, it's saying you will accommodate growth inside your cities because it's more sustainable to do that there and more efficient to do that there than out in rural areas. So it's a prohibition really on doing rural sprawl and more of it's a yes inside cities and urban growth boundaries, and we're going to limit it outside of those in the rural areas. And that's a big one for a lot of states right there. But it's really saying these are our housing projections, this is our economic development projections, and we are going to learn how to accommodate these and size our infrastructure to serve the anticipated growth. And we have a direct plan that has regulatory teeth that guides the growth. And in that kind of planning process, you can assess the risks and get out ahead of them. So I think that's the number one thing when I'm asked from people from other states, like, well, how do you do it and how do you avoid? Well, you have to know what the risks are. Are you avoiding the risks? Well, no. Well, then, you know, you're either on your heels or you're out in front of it. And so I think that is one real big one. I think in particular on affordability, I just mentioned this in Oregon, is that there are some new laws that are being passed that require us to look 20 years ahead and then start planning for specific levels of affordability. So Bend will have a target of, and I think it's around 32,000 housing units that we must plan for in our urban growth boundary for the next 20 years. A third of those are going to be under 80% of the area median income. So we have to not only plan for the amount, but the affordability. And so we're about to, and Bend is about to undergo this process, and the threat of wildfire will be front and center in this discussion of how we're going to grow, where we're going to grow, what are the trade-offs involved, trying to avoid those high-risk areas where you're moving out, trying to add that resiliency to your development pattern, and at the same time, hit those affordable targets. And I am less qualified to speak on the emergency response, but I agree. I mean, we are all at the City of Bend, and I'm sure other organizations right now are getting hammered with questions about what are you doing about wildfire? How are we going to prevent this from happening? What's happening in Southern California happening here? And I'm looking at our organization, and we are putting together talking points, and we're working together as multi-departmental entities, just trying to figure out all these answers. But it's a tough one because it hits so many different departments. It's all the local functions of government really having to be in partnership to address the planning for and then the response to these fires. And I think there's clearly, there are multi-departmental and agency groups that are operating to do this, but I think like anything, these systems and this coordination could be improved. So any questions on that? Any questions from the audience on this last topic?
I'll add something, Brian.
Or follow-up?
Just a short, and like Brian said, every city staff, every city department, county department can be advocates of reducing this risk. And I think that's where Bend is a great example of bringing, or Jeff and I talked about this earlier, bringing fire people, irrigation folks, public works people, parks, school district people together early on before these projects and figuring out what we need to do about that, because they can all be advocates in their own way at reducing that risk. They may not know it yet, but we can help educate them on what they can do when they review. Public Works reviews water systems or sewer systems, Park District opens up new fields. They can mitigate the wildfire risk in those fields. They can use those fields for space in case of an emergency. Same with school districts. So there's lots of ways we can bring the entire municipality in to reduce these that they may not be aware of.
I'd like to add something there too, as far as the federal side of things. I mentioned the FEMA deployment that I just returned from, and after a presidentially declared disaster, FEMA assigns an incident commander to lead and coordinate efforts across many federal agencies, and this is incredibly critical and highly effective in responding quickly to the disasters. I really think that we need to adopt this approach proactively and define our high-risk communities, whether that's a wildfire area or a flood zone. Thinking about the Representative's Farm, that is both a flood zone and a high-risk fire area. To work together and form this federal collaboration before the disaster strikes, using FEMA's model of what they're able to accomplish after a disaster strikes. And this, of course, requires really closely with state governors and working together amongst our agencies to really get smart on mitigation and planning.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Okay. So we'll move on to our third question. What role should each level of government play as it relates to housing resilience? So how can all levels of government support disaster mitigation and resilience of new builds and the existing housing stock without hindering essential efforts to increase supply? Who wants to take a...
Oh, here, let me jump in. The water's nice and warm, so. And we'll have differing perspectives here. So my perspective on this comes down to labor and workforce. And so I know we're looking for things to take forward from this meeting. So Senator Rosen from the state of Nevada last year introduced something called the Reconstruct Act, which I believe is going to get reintroduced again this year. And that is a focus in rural and underserved communities on workforce development. And I think that's something both, federal government, state government, local government, educating a workforce. We have a huge labor problem in this country and in the West in particular. And now with all the rebuilding that we're going to need to do, for every 10 people that retire, we've got one going into the trades, going into skilled labor. And we've got a massive shortage. Well, now this shortage is, again, kind of like the housing stock being exacerbated with existing housing being eliminated. Now we have a labor problem as well. So I think there needs to be a huge focus on that. I think the Reconstruct Act is a great tool for that. Funding from Job Corps. NAHB has HBI, the Home Builders Institute, which sets up training programs around the country. And so if you don't have a training program in Oregon or Bend, which I'm sure you do, more effort on bringing more people into the workforce. Start them in high school. Not everybody needs to go to college. I know that may be taboo for some, but I have 4 kids. 2 went to college, 2 worked for me as superintendents. And I love them all. I don't distinguish. I don't distinguish between them. But yeah, we need people going into the trades.
Thank you. Any thoughts from Kirsten or Doug?
I mentioned the need for interagency collaboration proactively before disasters occur. I think that's absolutely crucial with what we're seeing as far as the scale and intensity of the disasters across the West. Besides that, we, as the federal government, we're funders, we're regulators, and there is a lot of mitigation and planning funding out there to prepare for these types of events. So I don't really want to list out a bunch of acronyms right now. I'm prepared to if somebody has questions, but I'd rather meet with you in your community and bring the federal agencies and bring Keith at the VA and Jill from USDARD and our other federal partners and talk to you about how we can support you in your community.
Well, I think Oregon provides a great example of what can be done at a state level to support communities when it comes to hazard mitigation. Again, I know wildfire, and that's what I talk about, but Oregon is one of the few states that adopted a wildland-urban interface code. And yeah, there was some challenges with it for sure, and we probably made some mistakes in doing it, but we took the chance and did it. And there still was a lot of good that came out of that, and it's still kind of being worked through. We also set an example for other states. Colorado's looking at it. New Mexico's looking at it. There's other states that are looking at WUI codes. And so I think it's important that Oregon took that step. And local communities, especially low capacity communities, need that support from the state. They need technical assistance. They need capacity. If you got one land use planner, they're not going to be able to deal with the hazard. They're barely able to keep their head above water just dealing with the day-to-day stuff. And they need funding. And so I think states need to be a part of that. And even bigger, and I think I mentioned this before, money needs to come from the federal government to support these issues. I think less than with the BRIC grant, which is a huge program, less than 5% of BRIC grant money went for community wildfire resilience in this country. And so even though it's a great program that supports a lot of things, very little of it went toward community resilience. And so, again, I think we need to shift the what we view as the problem with this and start funding what's really going to make a difference at the community level, to keep our communities safer.
Yeah, and I would piggyback on what both of these much smarter people are saying in terms of the federal and state program. Fund Kirsten's programs better. That's what I'm hearing. Doug?
Yep, take it.
So as a locality, I think, and I see Lynn McConnell, our previous housing director, sitting in the audience, and we would talk in the hall and say, how are we going to get more? We've done as much as we possibly can on tweaking our codes, doing the planning, doing the things to get more affordable housing. We are such a pro-housing community. What do we need? We need money. We need the money, either from the state or the federal government. And maybe that gets old. Maybe that message gets old, but I think it's ringing loud and true. So I think that is one area where the Western Governors Association or Association of Governors, I'm new to this, I'm just a local guy, something like that. That would really help local jurisdictions who are proactive and are trying to do their best. And one of the things and some of these are, I would say, they're political, right? So some of these different funding requests are political. I think the one that is least political that also has a massive benefit is infrastructure and planning for infrastructure projects, because what we're finding here in Bend is that it's the pro forma of a developer to do any kind of housing, and then especially housing with an affordability component, is going to be challenged by the lack of infrastructure in a lot of these fast-growing communities. And so the more dollars that are applied to infrastructure, that's going to buy down what developers, what cities who are typically not exactly rolling in dough, can say, okay, we have done this project. That is taking it off the plate of a private developer to fund that and reducing those requirements, which makes it easier to provide that housing at a price point and makes it easier to provide that more affordable housing that's even at a deeper level of affordability that the market is not supporting. So I'd say infrastructure and funding for CDBG, and then of course in terms of housing resilience and what we can do there, I mean, I'm back to you got to have a plan for this. I think local jurisdictions are really the place for innovation. Even if a state doesn't require it, those local cities really planning ahead for the growth that they have, and making sure that you have land use plans to support economic development, housing. They're taking a look at affordability. They're avoiding those natural hazards and risks in areas that are that are very risky, and just tailoring that plan and having an honest conversation about how you're going to provide that housing, economic development as much as you can within your existing footprint. When you need to expand, do it in a way that reduces risks. Any questions on that one? We take repeat customers here.
I just wanted to mention something I haven't heard anyone mention yet, which is the Municipal Wildfire Risk Assessment Program. City of Ashland has been a pioneer in implementing this and having the fire department doing home risk assessments for homeowners and tying incentives, home hardening incentives, to those risk assessments. So we really see it as an individual homeowner's responsibility as well, because Brian, you mentioned developing in non-risk areas, but we're seeing a lot of urban fires. Our cities are burning. So, funding from Oregon State Fire Marshal has supported a lot of those programs. I don't know if Bend is taking advantage of that funding, but we need more funding for education, homeowner education too.
Amen. Doug, do you have a response to that?
No, I mean,
Okay.
yeah, that's a great program, and we do see it replicated in other parts of the country. Oregon's, again, ahead of the curve because of the funding from the State Fire Marshal's Office after the 2020 fires. We got a lot of funding, and it went to a lot of good. Ashland's a leader. I use it all the time across the country when it comes to that wildfire piece, reducing the hazards in their community, be able to fund those things. So kudos to them for sure.
Can I add something before?
Really quick, and then I think if you have any closing remarks, correct?
Well,
Okay.
I'll make these my closing remarks then. I just recognize it's really interesting to talk about the intersection of housing and natural disaster, because for a lot of us, we've been talking about this housing situation that we're in as an emergency, like as a humanitarian disaster. We've been talking about this for a long time. And suddenly when there's a disaster, then it unlocks all these resources, and like FEMA is there. And when I was on the deployment, I was working with disaster survivors, and they got an auto dialer on their cell phones and hit 1, and within 3 to 5 business days got 2 months of fair market rents deposited into their bank account. Like it is so fast. And so it's just, you know, I think that to truly address this housing emergency, the federal government really needs to prioritize streamlining our processes and waiving unnecessary requirements. And we need to deploy resources with greater urgency. And so I just couldn't leave this area without saying those words. I feel very strongly about that. Just want to thank you.
Thank you. Any closing thoughts or comments?
Yeah, you know, this has been a great discussion. I always come away from discussions like this thinking, yes, there is hope. So push for the Constructs Act because we are going to need bodies to rebuild. Funding, you know, who couldn't benefit from more money in the community, right? So we've got a lot of investment to do. We've got a lot of work to do. And if nothing more, and Governor Newsom from California actually just took a super bold step by suspending the California Environmental Quality Act and the Coastal Act to help rebuild. And sometimes that is an unintended but good consequence of a disaster, is it spurs people to action in a way that maybe they wouldn't otherwise. So all good stuff. Appreciate the conversation.
Thank you.
I'm glad you brought up